Welcome to the Chief's house. Now we say chiefs, plural, because there were two Miami Indian chiefs who were very important to the history of this house. And the first one is Chief Richardville, Jean-Baptiste Richardville. He built this house in the early 1830s, about 1832 to 1834. And he built this house pretty much as an office building. It was a treaty house. He really lived in Fort Wayne, which was called Kikiyanga at the time. Chief Richardville was a very important chief. There were several villages around, Miami villages, and they each had their own chief. But he was the civil or political chief of all of the Miami nation. And as I said, he was a very, very important chief because at this time in U.S. history, Indiana was the promised land. This was a land of opportunity. If you wanted to seek your fame and fortune, you wanted to go to Indiana. And so the white men were moving from the east, coming here to Indiana, moving west to clear lands and make farms and villages and towns. So the U.S. government was wanting to move the Native Americans out of wherever the white man was wanting to move. But when it came to Indiana and dealing with Chief Richardville as the political chief, he was able to negotiate some treaties which allowed some of the Miami people to stay on the lands that they had, and some of their descendants are still on those lands today. He was able to do that because he was educated some in Canada and raised by a white man. When we say Chief Richardville, that doesn't sound very Indian, but he had a French fur trader for a father and a Miami Indian mother. Well, he had 7 children, and one of those was Catherine. She married a man by the name of Francis LaFontaine. When Chief Richardville died in 1841, Francis LaFontaine became the new political chief of the Miami nation. And he and Catherine moved into this house, made it their home. It was no longer this office building or treaty building. He was the political chief then of the Miami nation, and in 1846 the U.S. government started moving the Miami people west who were going to the Kansas and Oklahoma territories. And he made several trips out that way with them to help them get settled. But on one of the trips on the way back, he contracted something like pneumonia and died in Lafayette, Indiana. Well, Francis and Catherine raised 7 children in this house. One of those is John. His picture's on the wall in the house, along with Catherine, Francis LaFontaine, and Chief Richardville. If you were to look at this picture of Francis LaFontaine, he looks like a really big man, and he was. Some people said he weighed over 350 pounds. And so he wanted to be a little more comfortable, so he had a special chair built. And the chair that's in the house is a very large chair, a wide chair for a wide body, big chair for a big man. When you walk into the foyer, you'll notice that this house was built with Christian doors. The Christian doors are like 6-panel doors that we have today, with the 2 very small panels at the top representing the Old Testament and New Testament in the Bible, and the 4 larger panels around the bottom representing the 4 Gospels in the Bible. You also notice in the foyer that there is a cutout in the wall that shows how the building was constructed back then. Today we would put boards and then drywall on, but back then they would have had the boards and then some thin strips of wood called lath, and they would smear plaster over that. The plaster would be mixed with maybe some horsehair or some fine grasses to get it to stick to the wall better. This house was very unusual and very unique for this area of the country at this time. The rest of the buildings were maybe log cabins or log homes like the Nook House, or maybe even homes made out of animal skins. A very unusual and very unique house. It's probably at least the second oldest, maybe even the oldest frame house in northern Indiana. And when you look at the railing going up the stairway, it's very low. We don't know why the railing is low like this, but apparently it must have fit the people at the time. There's a story that says that some of the boys that were raised in this house would get back in the bedroom upstairs and run over and jump over the low handrail and see how far down the steps they could land. Now, I don't know if that story is true or not, but it makes for a good tale. When you get to the top of the steps, there's a small room which may have been Chief Richard Ville's private office when he used this as an office building. When the LaFontaines lived here, it could have been a place for small children or their nursery. As you go into the bedroom, you'll see in the back corner what they might have used as a bathroom back then. A chair with a hole cut out of it and a pot underneath. Remember, there's no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no running water, different things back then. And each bed would have had a chamber pot underneath for use at night. And I assume that probably that would be somebody, maybe even the children's chores for the next morning, to empty those chamber pots. The bed in the room is a rope bed like all the beds in the house. This bed belonged to a man by the name of John Roche. Indiana had a law at that time that said if you're an Indian and you want to be in business in Indiana, you must have a white man as a business partner. Well, John Roche was the business partner of the LaFontaines. Richard Ville's and the LaFontaines were very, very wealthy people. They had their own businesses like grain mills and lumber mills and those kind of things, but there was a family fortune which had been accumulated over several generations by charging tolls for the long portage in southern Allen County that allowed people to go from the three rivers in Allen County to the Little Wabash River, a distance of, it varied, but sometimes about 12 miles, where they charged people to go across that land and also sometimes provided porters, which people had to pay for. This allowed people to go all the way from Lake Erie to New Orleans on water, except for that small expanse of land. When Richard Ville died in 1841, it's thought perhaps he was the wealthiest man in Indiana. And the LaFontaines, they used their money for some things you might have heard of, like Notre Dame. Notre Dame was in serious financial trouble in the 1840s. So the LaFontaines loaned between $2,000 and $3,000 to Notre Dame, and that kept the doors open, and the school is still there today. As we go into the back bedrooms and the upstairs of the house, to the right of the door hangs a picture of Archangel, who is the youngest daughter of the LaFontaines. And as we go back here, there are more rope beds and trundle beds. The children would have slept back here in these rooms, and they would have been pretty much on their own because the door that we just came through was not there until the 1970s when some work was done on the house. These beds would have been trundle beds, small children sleeping on the small bed when they pulled that out at night, and the bigger kids sleeping on the bigger bed. And then in the daytime, they could push that back underneath and have room to play or do whatever else they wanted to in the room. As we continue through the back of the upstairs, we'll go down very narrow stairs down into the kitchen. This stairs was used by the children, and sometimes there had some hired help that stayed here at the house, and they would have used these stairs and stayed in some of these bedrooms. It's said that maybe one of the Nuck girls had worked for them at one time. As we get into the kitchen, the fireplace is here. There's some sassafras root here for making sassafras tea. There's candle holders and candle mold making. Remember, no electricity in this house. The candles would have been made out of beeswax or tallow, which would have been very attractive to the rodents or the mice running around in the house at night. And so to keep them away from the mice, a tin hangs on the wall, and so they would put a lot of their candles in a tin like that to keep it away from the mice. You notice two closets here in the kitchen area. We do know for a fact that Richard Ville negotiated treaties with the U.S. government that obligated the Miami people to give up some of their lands. But it also obligated the U.S. government to pay the Miami people in silver for those lands that they gave up. It's said that he kept the silver in these closets here before he could distribute it to the leaders of the families as they came through. Not sure about that or not. And it said that some of the silver was stolen and thrown in the creek down the Long 24, which is now called Silver Creek. If you look at the fireplace is relatively small because originally this house was built as a treaty house and an office building, not necessarily for cooking purposes. But there is some evidence that there was a summer kitchen associated with this house, which would have been a separate building where you would cook in the summertime to keep the heat out of the building. There's a floor covering here of canvas type material, which sometimes people got sails from ships or something that would have been torn, and they would paint those and use them for floor covering. As you walk into the dining room, it's set for a formal dinner, and they would have had formal dinners. Modern furniture for them was brought maybe on canal boats and ordered from the East, maybe even some furniture that was ordered from Europe. As we said, they were very, very wealthy people, so they could afford some of the finest furniture. The china cabinet against the back wall belonged to Princess Kilsequaw. She was the granddaughter of Chief Little Turtle, and she died in 1915 at the age of 105.